Amid a howling blizzard tearing through the night, Max, a once legendary K9 German Shepherd, sits frozen, his ice-crusted fur clinging to a body that's given up on life. Betrayed by his handler and police team, cast aside like garbage after a botched mission, he's left to perish in the wild. The wind slices like knives, hunger claws at his gut, but the sting of abandonment cuts deeper than the storm. He's ready to let go, until staggering footsteps pierce the darkness, and a blood-soaked man emerges, whispering a plea for help. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. Snow stacked up against the warped remnants of a weathered wooden fence. Amid it all, a solitary shape sat still as stone. Max, a once mighty German Shepherd, K9, hardly raised his head against the ferocious storm. His dense fur was clumped with frost, his paws deadened by the biting cold seeping into his frame. His breath escaped in faint, uneven bursts, nearly lost in the gloom. All he'd ever known had vanished. The sting of betrayal cut deeper than the frigid gusts. Max had once been the faithful partner of a handler who'd vowed to stand by him, a man who'd pledged to shield him just as Max had guarded their squad. Together they'd braved peril, hunted felons through dark streets, tracked down lost kids, and faced life or death moments shoulder to shoulder. Max had poured his all into the work, into his handler, into the team. Yet in the end, they'd cast him aside. It had unfolded in a flash. A botched assignment, a suspect armed and dangerous, a split-second falter. Max had sprung forward, acting on his training, but his handler had reined him in, shouting him down. That split-second pause doomed the mission. The suspect slipped away. The fault landed squarely on Max. Whispers started softly at first. He's past his prime. Too wild. Unreliable now. Then one day the kennel gate stayed shut. His handler never came back. The officers strolling by scarcely spared him a look. He'd outlived his usefulness, so they cut him loose. They didn't even bother finding him a new place to belong. They just opened the truck, shoved him out, and drove off with the engine's rumble fading into the distance. That was days ago, or maybe more. Time had blurred. At first he'd tried to chase their trail, nose to the ground, seeking the familiar mix of oil and leather from his handler's gear. But the sense dissolved, buried under the heavy snow blanketing everything around him. Hunger gnawed at his insides. His body throbbed with pain. His legs, once strong and sure, struggled to keep him upright. He'd battled to stay alive. But tonight, with the tempest roaring, something inside him broke. Perhaps it was time to give up. His ears twitched faintly at the crack of branches far off. Reflex urged him to raise his head, to tune in, to brace himself. But why bother? He'd spent his whole life vigilant, poised, valuable. And for what? To be tossed aside like garbage? His gaze, once keen and driven, drifted aimlessly ahead, unfocused. His breath grew sluggish. The chill bore down on him, sinking its claws deeper into his weary frame. Then a noise pierced the night, distinct from the howling wind, unlike the snapping branches. Footsteps, deliberate and tentative, crunching through the snow. A whiff trailed after them. Human musk, tinged with the sharp bite of blood and something more. Panic, urgency. Max hardly shifted his gaze, but through the haze of fatigue, he caught sight of it. A figure staggering across the icy expanse, hand pressed to his side. Crimson smeared his jacket front, leaving a dark streak on the pristine snow. His face hid beneath a hood, yet his frantic steps betrayed him. Glancing back repeatedly, as if dreading a shadow lunging from the blackness behind. Once Max would have leapt to his feet, primed to defend, to gauge the threat. Now he merely stared, too drained to muster concern. The man crumpled nearby, his breath harsh and uneven, trembling from cold and collapse. For a heartbeat, neither stirred. Then the man tilted his head, his eyes meeting Max's. A spark of understanding flickered between them, not from familiarity, but from a shared plight in that instant. Both forsaken, both shattered, both left to perish. The storm screamed around them, yet they stayed rooted. The man gripped his side, straining to rise. He lurched toward Max, dropping to his knees a mere step away. His gasps rasped, hands quivering. "Save me," he breathed, his voice a frail murmur lost in the gale. Max didn't budge, didn't flinch. He'd rescued humans before, given his all, and they'd repaid him with indifference. Why should he give a damn now? His eyes drifted shut, exhaustion dragging him under. The man shook harder, fighting to hold himself up. The reek of blood grew sharper. Whatever had struck him, his time was running out. Yet amid the fog of weariness, a faint ember stirred in Max. A reflex, a memory, a duty long buried under layers of hurt. Protecting was etched into his core, woven into his very being. No matter how cruelly the world had scorned him, he couldn't quite bury who he was. Not yet. With a sluggish, aching effort, he raised his head, ears perking as he sifted through the wind's wail. Something else was out there, and it was drawing near. The man's breast grew faint, his frame shuddering from frost and blood loss. Max regarded him with bleary, burdened eyes. Every fiber urged him to turn aside, to dismiss this human agony as humans had dismissed his own. But a stubborn spark held him fast. The wind roared once more, bearing a scent that sent a chill through his marrow. They were prey now. He hauled himself upright, joints stiff and sore from the freeze. The man moaned, clawing at the ice as he tried to shift. He was feeble, too frail to flee, too frail to resist. Max could walk away. It wasn't his burden anymore. Yet his limbs moved before his thoughts could halt them. With measured, wary steps, he neared the man, nose testing the air. Blood overwhelmed the senses, but beneath it lingered a trace. Known, leather, gunpowder, cop gear. Max faltered. This wasn't some random soul. He was one of them. Fury surged, hot and biting. Hadn't they taken enough? Hadn't they already stripped him bare? Hadn't they shown they cared nothing for him? His muzzle twitched, a snarl brewing low in his throat. Then the man murmured something, soft, fragile, but clear to Max's ears. "Please." One word, no demands, no authority, pure need. A brittle snap of twigs sliced through the storm. Someone was near. Max's ears swiveled. He angled his head toward the void beyond the trees. His vision, blurred from exhaustion moments ago, sharpened. His body, frozen in pain just minutes before, suddenly felt alert. His instinct screamed at him. Danger. The man tried to push himself up again, his fingers digging into the snow. "They're coming," he whispered. "They can't find me." Max's mind raced. His trust in humans had been shattered, but his training remained. He knew how to track. He knew how to hide. He knew how to survive. He could run. He could leave this man behind. Let fate decide his outcome. But deep inside, he wasn't built to abandon. Max lowered his head, pressing his nose against the man's shoulder. He caught a faint scent beneath the blood. A vest, a badge, a man who had once taken an oath. Maybe this one was different. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. The wind shifted, carrying voices. Low, distant, but closing in. Max's decision was made. With a deep exhale, he moved closer to the man, nudging him forward. The man groaned, barely able to keep himself upright. Max growled softly. A command, not a request. Move. The man didn't argue. He gritted his teeth and forced himself onto his hands and knees. Max pressed against him, using his body as support, guiding him toward the tree line. Every step was slow, painful. The man staggered, his boots dragging through the thick snow. The voices were closer now. Max's heartbeat quickened. They wouldn't make it in time. His eyes scanned the terrain. To their right, a small cluster of boulders jutted from the frozen ground. Shelter. It wasn't perfect, but it would buy them time. He growled again, pushing the man toward the rocks. The man followed, gripping Max's fur for balance. His body was too weak to run, but he moved, driven by the same instinct keeping Max alive. Survive. They reached the boulders just as the first flashlight beams cut through the trees. Max pressed himself and the man against the stone, lowering his body into the shadows. Footsteps crunched in the snow. Max held his breath. The man did too. The voices were clear now. "Are you sure he came this way? Blood trail leads here." He couldn't have gone far. Max's ears flicked at the sound of a safety being clicked off. A gun. A new scent drifted toward him. Adrenaline. Aggression. The unmistakable stench of men who had killed before. They weren't police. They were hunters. The man's grip on Max's fur tightened slightly, his breathing ragged but controlled. He knew it too. Max's muscles tensed. He could fight, but he was weak. The man could run, but he wouldn't make it far. They had one chance. Stay hidden. Stay silent. Hope the storm covered their tracks. The footsteps stopped just feet from their hiding spot. One of the men cursed under his breath. Damn storms messing with the tracks. A flashlight beam passed over the rocks, barely missing them. Max stayed completely still. His heart pounded, but he didn't move. A pause. Then, "Let's check further ahead. If he's still bleeding, he won't last long anyway." The footsteps started again, fading into the distance. Max didn't relax. He didn't move. He listened, waited, made sure the danger had truly passed. Only when the wind swallowed their voices completely did he release a slow breath. The man shuddered against him. Relief, exhaustion, maybe even gratitude. Max didn't care about gratitude. He only cared about one thing now, getting them both out alive. The storm had covered their tracks for now, but Max knew it wouldn't last. The men weren't fools. They were hunters, and they had come prepared. Once the wind calmed and the snowfall thinned, they would find the blood trail again. And when they did, they wouldn't hesitate. Max turned his head toward the man slumped beside him. His breathing was labored, his face pale beneath the hood of his jacket. The blood loss was getting worse. If they stayed here much longer, the cold would finish what the hunters had started. Max growled low in his throat. They had to move. The man stirred at the sound, his eyelids fluttering open. He tried to push himself up, but his arms shook violently, his strength failing him. Max pressed his nose against the man's chest, sniffing carefully. His heartbeat was weak but steady. He could still make it if he had help. The man exhaled slowly. "You're still here," he murmured, barely above a whisper. His breath came out in white puffs against the freezing air. Max didn't react. He wasn't here for him. He was here because instinct told him to survive, and survival meant staying ahead of the danger. The man coughed, then winced as pain shot through his body. His hand moved to the wound at his side, fingers trembling. He tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Max watched him struggle for a moment, then made his decision. He stepped closer, positioning himself beside the man and nudging his shoulder roughly. The man blinked in confusion. Max nudged him again, harder this time. "Get up!" A flicker of understanding crossed the man's face. He swallowed, gritting his teeth. "You want me to move?" Max let out a short, sharp breath. "Yes." The man exhaled, then gave a weak nod. He reached out, hesitating for a brief second before gripping Max's thick fur. With a painful groan, he pulled himself upright, leaning heavily against the dog's side. Max adjusted his stance, bracing against the man's weight. His muscles burned from the cold, but he ignored the pain. They didn't have time for weakness. The wind howled again, but this time Max heard something else beneath it. Voices. The hunters were circling back. A fresh surge of adrenaline shot through him. He nudged the man forward, forcing him to move. They wouldn't make it far in this condition, but they had to try. Step by step, they pushed forward into the storm. The snow came down hard, stinging Max's eyes, but he relied on his instincts. His ears twitched, his nose worked overtime, scanning the air for any sign of safety. The man's breathing was harsh and uneven, but he kept moving, dragging his injured body forward with sheer willpower. Minutes passed, then more. Max didn't know how long they walked, only that the voices behind them grew fainter with each agonizing step. Then he smelled it. Smoke. Not thick like a wildfire. Thin, controlled. A fire. Max's ears perked. Where there was fire, there was shelter. The man must have smelled it too, because he whispered, "Someone's out here." His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the storm. Max didn't stop. He guided the man toward the scent, moving faster now. Determined, If they could just reach that fire, they might stand a chance. Through the thick haze of snow, a faint glow appeared in the distance. A cabin. The structure was small, barely visible against the white backdrop, but it was real. Smoke curled from a metal chimney, flickering light shining through the cracks of a wooden door. Max's pulse quickened. They had found safety. The man sagged against him, nearly collapsing in relief. "We made it," he breathed. Max didn't celebrate. His instincts remained sharp. They weren't safe yet. Someone was inside, and they had no idea whether that person would be a friend or another enemy. The wooden cabin stood like a lone beacon in the storm, its warm glow barely cutting through the raging blizzard. Max's body remained tense, his ears twitching as he listened for movement inside. The scent of smoke and burning wood filled his nose, masking whatever or whoever might be waiting inside. The man beside him was barely standing, his weight pressed heavier against Max, his legs trembling with exhaustion. His lips were pale, his breath uneven. He wouldn't last much longer out here. Max had a choice. Venture inside and face whatever awaits. Remain out here and let the storm claim them both. A fierce wind snapped at his fur, forcing the choice upon him. With a guttural growl, Max pushed the man onward. "Go! Now!" The man drew a shaky breath, managing a weak nod as he stumbled toward the door. His numb fingers struggled with the knob before finally twisting it open. The door groaned as it swung inward. A wave of heat poured out, clashing with the frigid air. Max entered first. His muscles ached, his body weary, but his senses stayed keen as ever. His gaze swept the cabin, small, rugged, chaotic. A fire roared in a stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the timber walls. A table held remnants of a meal, a rifle rested against the wall, and in the corner stood a man. Tall, sturdy, his face obscured by a thick beard, his dark eyes fixed on them with wary interest. He stayed still, not reaching for the gun nearby. Not yet. Max positioned himself ahead of the wounded man, his frame taut, prepared. The stranger observed them for a long beat, his eyes shifting from the bleeding figure to Max, then back. Then he spoke. "Looks like you've been through hell tonight." He remained by the fire, his stare piercing, assessing. Max didn't trust him, not yet. Behind him, the injured man wavered, barely staying upright. He took a jagged breath and rasped out, "We need help!" The stranger let out a slow breath through his nose, leaning forward just a touch. His eyes darted to Max, then returned to the man. "Help, huh?" His voice was low, coarse like stone. "Who's chasing you?" Max's ears flicked. He didn't like that question. The injured man faltered. His legs gave out. Before he could crash down, the stranger sprang up. Quick. Max bared his teeth, stepping in front, but the man only caught the falling figure before he hit the floor. "Easy," he grunted. He slung the injured man's arm over his shoulder and hauled him toward the fire. Max stayed on edge. He stayed where he was, his muscles tight, watching every movement. The stranger settled the injured man onto a pile of blankets near the fire. Then slowly he reached for a metal pot, pouring hot water into a small bowl. "You're lucky I found you first," he muttered. Max's fur bristled. "Found?" The man turned, his gaze meeting Max's. He held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, dog. I ain't the one trying to kill your friend." Max didn't move. The stranger smirked slightly. "But they won't stop looking. And if we don't act fast, they'll find you both before sunrise." Max remained still, listening, waiting. Then at last he understood. This wasn't just shelter. This was a battleground, and the real fight hadn't even begun. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Max remained where he was, standing between the injured man and the stranger, his muscles still tense. His paws ached from the cold. His body begged for rest, but he didn't trust this place. Not yet. The stranger moved deliberately, slow enough that Max wouldn't see him as a threat. He dipped a rag into the steaming water and turned to the injured man. "Lift your shirt," he ordered. The man faltered, his strength draining fast. He groaned, clutching his side as he weakly lifted his jacket and stained shirt, soaked crimson. Max's nose flared. The gash was severe, deep, torn, oozing slowly. The sharp tang of blood mingled with the cabin's smoky, damp air. The stranger let out a quick breath. "Bullet just nicked you, you lucky son of a gun. Another inch, and you'd be a goner." The man managed a faint, grim laugh. "Doesn't feel like luck." Max kept his eyes trained as the stranger pressed a steaming cloth to the wound. The man stiffened, jaw clenched, but stayed silent. Pain was no stranger to him. "So," the stranger grumbled as he worked, "you gonna spill while you've got killers on your tail?" The man swallowed hard, eyes shutting briefly. "I was a cop once," he confessed at last. "Stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see." The stranger arched a brow. "Let me guess. Crooked higher-ups?" The man gave a small, bitter nod. "Deep rot, top brass, dangerous folks. I had proof, solid evidence, enough to bring them down. But someone on the inside sold me out before I could blow the whistle." His voice faded, growing faint. "They came for me, nearly finished the job." The stranger sighed, shaking his head. "And now they're making damn sure you don't talk." The man barely dipped his head before it lolled back against the blankets. His breathing slowed, steady but shallow. Fatigue had won. Max settled beside him, ears sharp, still tuned to the storm outside. It raged on, but he knew better than to think it'd shield them. The hunters tracking them weren't the type to quit. The stranger rose, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes slid to Max. "And you?" he asked, voice low now. "What's your deal?" Max didn't budge. The stranger smirked. "Didn't figure you'd say much." He crossed to a wooden chest in the corner and pulled something out. Max tensed as he approached, but the stranger only set down a metal dish. The rich scent of meat wafted up. "Thought you might need it," he muttered. Max paused. Hunger gnawed at him, but caution held firm. The stranger didn't push, just stepped back to the fire. "Take your time," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "But I'd eat if I were you. Gut says you'll need the energy." Max's ears flicked. Then cutting through the storm's howl, he caught it. Far off, quiet but clear. Footsteps. The hunters had returned. Max's frame went rigid, his fur spiked. Hunger vanished in a flash. He whipped toward the door, muscles tightening. The stranger picked up on it. "What's out there?" Max didn't respond. He didn't have to. A moment later, the stranger heard it too, the deliberate crunch of boots on snow. He swore under his breath. Snatching the rifle from the wall, he checked its load. "They must have doubled back." Max bristled, a low growl rumbling deep in his throat. The stranger shot him a look. "Yeah, I'm not thrilled either." The footsteps halted. Silence fell. Then a sharp crack. Wood shattered. The door jolted hard. Max surged forward, barking, hackles up. The stranger raised the rifle, slipping into the shadows. "Looks like your friends don't like waiting." Max growl deepened, his instincts roaring to life. This time he wasn't running. This time he was ready to fight. The cabin door rattled again, shaking under the force of another impact. Snow swirled in through the cracks carried by the icy wind. Max stood rigid, his teeth bared, muscles coiled like a spring. The stranger beside him kept his grip firm on the rifle, eyes locked on the door. Then silence. Max's ears twitched, listening. No footsteps, no voices, just the wind and the slow creak of wood settling under the pressure. "They're waiting," the stranger muttered under his breath. Max didn't move. He knew the game. Predators knew when to strike. They weren't breaking in yet because they were waiting for the right moment, waiting for their targets to drop their guard. The man on the floor groaned, shifting slightly under the blanket. He was still too weak to fight, too weak to run. That meant only one option remained. Max's breathing slowed as he crouched low, creeping toward the door. His paws were silent on the wooden floor. His instincts screamed at him to be ready. Then a shadow passed by the window. The stranger saw it too. "Damn it," he whispered, gripping the rifle tighter. A second later, something slammed against the back of the cabin. Max spun, growling. They weren't just coming through the front. "They're trying to box us in," the stranger realized. One at the front, one at the back, maybe more. Max didn't hesitate. He lunged toward the back door, his paws skidding slightly as he reached the wooden frame. He sniffed once, catching the scent of sweat, metal, gunpowder, then movement. The doorknob turned. Max attacked. He launched himself forward just as the door cracked open, his body slamming into it with full force. The door exploded outward. A startled curse rang out as a man staggered back, caught off guard. Max struck like lightning. His teeth found an arm, sinking into thick fabric. The man creamed, thrashing backward into the snow. A gunshot rang out. The bullet missed, burying itself in the wooden frame. The stranger inside the cabin fired back, his shot cracking through the night. Max didn't let go. He held on, twisting his body, pulling the attacker down. The man crashed into the snow, yelling in pain. Another gunshot, this one close. Too close. Max released just in time, ducking as another attacker fired from the side. The bullet missed him by inches, sending up a spray of ice. The stranger's rifle roared again. One of the men collapsed, a sharp cry torn from his throat. Max didn't stop. He turned sharply, eyes locking onto the second man. The attacker hesitated. He had a gun, but Max was already moving. The German shepherd leapt, his body cutting through the air, his teeth finding a throat. A gurgled scream, a geek clattering into the snow. Then silence. The wind howled around them. The snow swirled, but no more shots came. Max released, panting, his breath visible in the cold air. His fur was dusted with frost and blood. The stranger stepped forward, his rifle still raised, scanning the trees. Nothing. No more movement. No more threats. Max let out a low, cautious growl, his ears a-twitching. Was it over? The stranger exhaled sharply. Not bad, dog, he muttered. Max didn't look at him. His golden eyes remained locked on the bodies in the snow. He had survived. They had survived. But something inside him whispered, this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of blood and gunpowder. Max stood motionless, his body still tense, his breath steady but sharp. His instincts told him to stay alert. Predators didn't always fall so easily. The stranger lowered his rifle, exhaling slowly. They'll have more, he muttered. Men like them don't give up. Max's ears flicked. He already knew that. The injured man inside groaned, shifting weakly beneath the blankets. He didn't have time. They didn't have time. The stranger glanced at Max. We need to move. Max didn't hesitate. He was ready. The cabin was no longer safe. Max knew it. The stranger knew it. The injured man was barely holding on, his breathing shallow. The tracks in the snow wouldn't stay hidden forever. More would come. The stranger tightened his grip on the rifle. We leave now. Max's ears twitched, his body tensed. The night was still dangerous, but standing still meant death. Without another word, they stepped into the storm. They moved fast. The stranger led, keeping his rifle ready. Max stayed close, his body low, eyes scanning the darkness. The injured man struggled, leaning heavily on them both. His steps were weak, his strength fading. Max could smell the blood. Too much blood. They needed shelter. Fast. Then through the snow, a light, a building, a chance, or maybe a trap. The stranger hesitated. Max didn't. He stepped forward first, sniffing the air. No fresh tracks, no human scent. Safe. For now. The stranger pushed the door open. The injured man collapsed inside, too weak to stand. Max stayed near the entrance, watching, waiting, because he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The injured man's breathing was slow, too slow. Max lay beside him, his ears twitching at every sound. The stranger was silent, deep in thought. They were alive, but for how long? Then a noise outside, distant, unfamiliar. Max stood, hackles rising. Something was coming. A car. Its engine rumbled in the night, tires crunching against the frozen ground. Headlights pierced the darkness. Max's body tensed. The stranger grabbed his rifle. No more running. Not this time. The car slowed. A door opened, and then a voice, low, calm, deadly. You've got something that belongs to me? Max growled. The real fight had just begun. Max's story chills me. From a betrayed K9 ready to give up, to the moment he surged into battle, shielding a stranger with every ounce of strength left. I used to think loyalty was just a fairy tale, but watching him snarl at danger, exhausted yet unbroken, showed me it's fiercer than any pain. Now, with that mysterious car pulling up, I know Max's fight isn't over, and I can't look away. If this grips you like it does me, if you're drawn to tales of courage rising from the dark, join me. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit that bell so you don't miss these gripping stories. Thanks for being here, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.